most of during the War of the years. Stuart was born here on the headwaters of the Pomsted River on December 3rd, 1775, in a house that his father had built 4 years prior, soon after marrying his mother. Gilbert Stuart Sr. was an introduction first with a background as a miller, and his mother, Elizabeth Anthony, was from the fairly wealthy farming family from Middleton, the Anthony family. Stuart and his family would live here the first 6 years of his life before before moving to Newport. The Stuart family operated the mill successfully for 10 years, milling snuff. It's actually the first snuff mill in the U.S. colonies. For those of you who don't know, snuff is tobacco that's ground to an exceptionally fine powder so that it can be taken nasally. That was extremely popular during the time, and as the first in the country, it provided a robust living for the families until competition decreased the amount of income that it provided. But the Stuarts stayed in the snuff business, and with the benefit of an inheritance, they moved back to civilization, otherwise known as Newport, and opened up a general store in Newport on Bannister's Wharf. That's where the more or less artistic story of Stuart begins, and he meets his first instructor, a gentleman by the name of Napoleon Thurston. He is a cooper by trade, and a man who is owned by the cooper who lives near the Stuart family, who lives next door to the Stuart family on Bannister's Wharf. Mr. Thurston taught Stuart how to draw faces. He was famous, amongst other things, for drawing human faces on the barrels that were produced in this coopering function, this coopering business, so that you could always tell them they were created by Napoleon Thurston. And it's by Stuart's own account, that's where he became absolutely fascinated by the human face and what you could do artistically to communicate for advance. That started Stuart on his journey. We don't have any photos from this period. In fact, the records are a bit sketchy. We only have Stuart's own account later on in his life because Napoleon Thurston was enslaved. Stuart continued on at Trinity School, where he made friends with Benjamin Waterhouse. Both of them were fascinated by artistry, and Waterhouse would produce. We'll see more pictures of him in a second. Waterhouse would produce many. They used to compete by Waterhouse's own account. They used to compete for artistry. And it wasn't until Stuart produced this, The Hunter Dogs, that Waterhouse essentially just gave up and said, medicine it is. This painting is famously Stuart's first professional painting. It was produced around the age of 14. Dr. William Hunter, was a physician in Newport who was treating a member of the family, who was treating the family, asked the young artist he was in the market for painting of his dogs, and asked the young artist to produce it. Off the back of this, Dr. Hunter also got Cosmo Alexander, who was a prominent Scottish painter, to take Stuart under his wing as an apprentice. Cosmo Alexander, this is where you see Stuart begins formal education. The image on the left is Cosmo Alexander. The one on the right is a reproduction of the painting that he's painting. He was a very famous Scottish painter. Got up got mixed up in the Troubles, but also wasn't now the Troubles, the modern ones. It was also the Jacobite ones back in the 18th century in Scotland, the Jacobite insurgency. It's a lot of political turmoil. So he had traveled to the United States. He's also working in a slightly older, flatter style. As you can see, this self-portrait over here, it's not really what you associate with Stuart's later works. And Stuart began his apprenticeship with Cosmo Alexander around 1770. And at the age of 15, they soon traveled to Philadelphia, Williamsburg, Norfolk, Charlestown, and ultimately to Scotland. Most likely Edinburgh, which is where Cosmo Alexander was based. But unfortunately, soon after his arrival in Scotland in 1771 or 1772, Cosmo Alexander passed away. Stuart may have taken some formal courses, but by and large tried to get back to port as soon as possible. And that's where we start to see his first Tudor works. These are two of the most famous. They're John Bannister and Christian Sella Bannister and her son. You can see in these images the sort of rounded but slightly flat affect that came from his tutelage under Cosmo Alexander.
Yeah.
While he was in Newport, he did set up a practice and developed something of a reputation for himself. He painted The Great and the Good. This is Mrs. Erin Lopez and her son Joshua. And he's starting to pick up skills from other artists that he's seen. This one, Francis Malbone and his brother Saunders Malbone, were extremely wealthy merchants living in Newport at the time. I don't know if you've ever passed the Malbone estate, but it's still one of the largest homes in Newport and still in private hands. So they're very, very wealthy. And this one shows a highlight of the skills and techniques he was picked up looking at the work of John Singleton Copley. We see the sort of faraway look in the sitter's eyes, and also a lot of marveling in the shiny table, the fancy woodworking, and the silver, the ingots that they're making use of. But this is one of the last paintings that he produced while he was in Newport, and it's worth a stop because it's a monument to one of the most important friendships that Stuart had during the course of his life. I mentioned his competitive friendship with Benjamin Waterhouse. This is the man. Also, there's pernicious rumor that Stuart couldn't paint hands. And as you can see, that Waterhouse's hand, it's extremely prominent in the image. Waterhouse is reading a medical book. Waterhouse was something of a polymath. Well, he was very competitive with Stuart in his desire to be an artist. He was also an avid reader of works of philosophy and medicine, and spent most of his free time at the Redwood Library, which is believed where this one is set, and is currently where the painting now resides. I'd encourage all of you to go see it. The painting was almost certainly completed after Waterhouse had actually left to complete his studies, or to begin his studies at the University of Edinburgh, which at the time was one of the premier medical schools in the entire world, or at least they were open now, cadavers. Stuart himself would actually depart 6 months later, in fact, because, as you can imagine, in 1775, in Newport, things are getting very, very tense. It's also through Waterhouse that we know another one is the pernicious myths about Stuart isn't he was, in fact, any loyalist, which is not borne out by Waterhouse's own diaries from the time. Waterhouse was a royalist, as were Stuart's parents. So Waterhouse has some very interesting anecdotes about gestures of disrespect to that king and the king's representatives, and suggestions that that they should hang the king because he's much too far to be doing any good to us anyway. He was, however, for all of his revolutionary leanings, Stuart was very, very viscerally aware at this point in his life, just in his early 20s, that he'd had only about 3 years of formal education. And while he'd learned a lot, he was still picking things up from other working artists in Boston and Newport, and he was definitely not done on his educational journey. So he followed his friend off the increasingly tendentious shores of the Revolution for London. When he arrived in London, right to there, Stuart was, Waterhouse had already left for Edinburgh. So Stuart found himself in London with no friends, no plans, and no real clue what he was going to do with himself, beyond the general desire to continue to study art. He had aspirations that were somewhat vague about gaining tutelage under Benjamin West, who was the court caterer to King George, but a fellow American living abroad. So he pursued those goals, but one of the things that comes up in a lot of Waterhouse's writing about Stuart is that he would go through frenzies of activity and then periods where he could not be convinced to do anything at all. Current writers, particularly Dorinda Evans, have postulated that he likely suffered from what you currently recognize as bipolar disorder, which is extremely consistent with the accounts that Waterhouse, particularly as a medical person himself, it kept of his friends extremely erratic in activities. So when Waterhouse came down to London over the summer following his first year of study at Edinburgh, what he discovered was his friend living in a flat over a tailor's shop, who, despite all of his artistic talent, was supporting himself as a church organist at St. Catherine's in London. So he took his friend, took him out, forced him to take on a mission serve his friends, forced him to write again into Benjamin West, not just the one letter he'd written before. At this point, his ego was pretty broken, so he writes a very pleading and pathetic letter to Benjamin West, who does take pity on the young student and allows him into his studio. Stuart, who is... there are two things that persist throughout the entire story of Stuart's life. One is the stories that he told, and two, and they're very intertwined, is his absolutely ginormous ego. He is very convinced when he is up and active. He's very, very convinced of his own immense skill, and when he is down, as he appears to have been during this period, was not. So with the benefit of, once he had gained entry into West's studio and gaining tutelage, his skill began to rise meteorically. This painting right here is possibly his most famous from the period in London, and it is a self-portrait that he gave to Waterhouse at the end of his time, before Waterhouse moved on to Switzerland to continue his study. This, sometimes called self-portrait part 3, Stuart is starting to look at shapes more as compositions of light and dark, as three-dimensional figures within space, as distant lines and flat surfaces are colored in. This is his time under his third and final formal instructor, Benjamin West. during the painting of the portrait of Benjamin West, we have West doing an adorable little sketch of Gilbert Stuart painting him. Which I love. And you can actually see up in the top corner, it says, Mr. Stuart painting Mr. West, painting Mr. West's portrait, 1783. It was under West's tutelage where his skill really blossomed. He would set, Stuart was extremely competitive, and there's a story in particular about this one previous image that Stuart had purchased at a junk sale, a painting by William Dobson. And West was so taken with the portrait that Stuart had purchased that he tried to buy it from Stuart. Stuart's perpetually cash strapped, but West kept raising his offer to Stuart, and Stuart kept saying no, and then finally relented, saying, I won't take any money for it. But the moment when I can paint something that you think is as good as Dobson's paintings, then I'll give you the painting for free. So that actually is the origin of this story. Stuart does not do very many self-portraits, and that is his account of how this one began. That he worked this and reworked it until he had West's approval. As with most of Stuart's stories, they're very good, but they're probably not all entirely accurate. They say Stuart was regularly strapped for cash. The idea that he's trying down large amounts of money from his sponsor are not wildly likely, but by the same token, it's an excellent demonstration of how much more he valued West's praise for his skill than he valued any amount of money. So it is actually under West's tutelage that he produces this work right here, The Skater, portrait from William Grant. This painting is essentially the first time that Stuart made it big. This hangs in the National Academy of the Arts. It's a show for the Royal Academy show. Apologies. And it causes an absolute sensation. Stuart is still a trainee, and he's still working in under West's tutelage, but he gets this commission, and not only does he produce a full-length commission, which I haven't shown you any of before. In fact, I'm not sure there are any prior to this. He had been given a commission while he was in Newport, but had declined it, which in a move that Waterhouse chalked up to Stuart's being in one of his low periods, that he had put out extensively that he wanted him to do a full-length commission. Abraham Redwood of Redwood Library finally relented and came to him, and Stuart turned him down. This is another commission that he's got. He has a reputation, it's said, of now being able to paint below the fifth button. And so Stuart responds to this implied challenge. This people respond to virtually every challenge, implied, explicit, even entirely in his own mind, by producing something that is so far above what he's been told he can't do, that it is entirely off the rails. So William Grant comes to him for a portrait, a full-length portrait, and they're sitting in the studio. The snow is falling outside, and you can see the River Thames from Stuart's studio. On the Thames, people are skating. Stuart has known how to skate since he was a very young child. Ran up on the middle pond. He learned as early as he could walk. But skating as a practice for gentlemen is only very, very new. Only a few years prior to this, I believe it was actually 1780, you see the publication, 1779, I believe it actually is, publication of a treatise of the gentlemanly attitudes to be observed while skating. It is produced by the Skating Club of Evanston Loch in Edinburgh. And it lists, amongst other things, appropriate etiquette to be observed by gentlemen and ladies, actually explicitly gentlemen, while skating. And these sort of practices open this up for something that can be enjoyed, but more than just the lower classes. Mr. Grant here is performing the role, which is one of the three attitudes. That's the poses, the way they're described by Leah in the book. And you see everyone around that. He's performing, I believe there's one that you can see in the back. So this pose, which is the Mercury. And it's very, very silly, but this is sort of the first time that it's socially appropriate for people to partake in this activity. Even in Stuart's own accounts, he takes the opportunity to show off and is performing tricks, the likes of which no one has seen, particularly all these gentlemen who have only recently found themselves socially allowed to engage in this activity. Stuart, who also famously has a relatively eidetic memory, when they finish up on the ice, goes back to his studio. He produces this, not just a portrait, not just a full-length portrait, but a portrait of an individual engaged in a sporting activity. People are regularly engaged in activities, but rarely anything as vigorous as skating. And that also, you need to take into consideration that skating, because of all of the aforementioned developments, is about the most cutting edge activity anyone can be engaged in right now. It's very, very cool. It's very, very active. It's very, very, it is supreme demonstration of his skill as a portraitist. So Stuart, while in London, off the back of his painting, he makes a name for himself. He gets married to Miss Charlotte Coates, starts a young family. Stuart, however, and this is part and parcel with the high and low behavior that was mentioned, that was observed as far back as his teenage years by Benjamin Waterhouse, also exceptionally bad money. He is constantly in debt. He lives well outside of his means, and in as much as this is tied to his difficulties with emotional regulation broadly, it's also worth pointing out, and it's possible for artists to live modest and moderate existences, but it is also worth pointing out that there is something especially expensive about being a portraitist. Most artists would do other work. They would, Benjamin West tried to get Stuart to break out and do more than just portraiture, to do landscapes, genre paintings, mythologies, any number of what Stuart liked to call his 10-acre paintings. Ginormous. Stuart had absolutely no interest in that. The only thing Stuart wanted to do at all was faces. And so in order to do faces, you need to paint rich people. And in order to paint rich people, you need to know a lot of rich people. You need to be able to hang out with them. You need to be able to entertain them. You do need to be able to keep them happy. So that is an expensive course, a professional course to set out for yourself. Particularly, as I say, you're not the best with money. So Stuart finds himself, after 18 years in London, deeply in debt. He gets commission from John Fitzgibbon. And if you don't know your Irish history, he's the Lord Mayor of Dublin. And not particularly well-liked one at that. But he gets this commission, very, very prestigious commission. He is in Dublin when he receives word that the bailiffs are at the door of his studio in London. Sorry?
What?
Apologies. Can I? What did my...
What else?
Oh, no, the bailiffs are at the door. They're there to collect his debts and anything else they can find in service of those debts. So he decides that this brief trip to London, to Dublin, to paint the Lord Mayor is going to be permanent. He lives in Dublin for another 6 years, where he reestablishes himself. This painting, Anna Dorothea Foster and Charlotte Anna Dick, is one of the notable paintings to come out of this period. He's again painting the great and the good, the wealthy, and he is making a name for himself in Dublin, but that, again, he's living beyond his means. So after 6 years in Dublin, he's not in exactly the same position. He can see where the wind is headed. But also it's decided that he would like to paint George Washington. This becomes a driving concern of his while he's in London, so works in Dublin. And he writes to a number of good friends, London, family back in the United States, that this is what he's going to do next. So you would think that the next step would be to paint, would be to travel to Philadelphia, because that's where Washington is. Instead, he does not. He packs his wife and 4 of his children onto a boat, and they head instead for New York. While in New York, he paints, he establishes himself again. He's not without reputation at this stage. He has painted enough people in London, enough American and British and European dignitaries, and there is enough back and forth between the two young nations, between the young nation of the United States and the older European nations, that his reputation has preceded him, but he doesn't have a lot of American practice to back him up on. So he gets commissions from personages like the Gates family. Richard Gates was a merchant. It's actually a royalist at the time of the Revolution, but as with many, once they found out who won, they were happy to do business and right on going. There were a number of, the Yates family set up had a sort of salon of sorts going. Stuart was active socially, active professionally, and this is another immense period of growth that we see from him as an artist. You'll notice a difference between there's a situational necessity, the grandeur of painting the Mayor of Dublin, please forgive me. And these paintings of the Yates family. One observation we get a lot at the birthplace is that Mrs. Yates is not particularly pretty. But that actually is something to the skill development that we see, particularly in this period, because it really is here where he starts to both take in and demonstrate in his painting a distinctly American nature. There are works being done. These women, these young girls, they look absolutely beautiful and angelic and lovely. Mrs. Yates is engaged in a very similar activity and receives none of the excessive flattery that the young girls do. Now, this is obviously, there are differences in appropriateness with how he treats the young girls versus how he treats the older Mrs. Yates. But there is also a reason why this is generally, particularly Mrs. Yates, as opposed to Mr. Yates. Particularly Mrs. Yates is seen as the absolute apogee of American Republican portraiture era, because she does have a mustache. She does have a mustache. I mean, it's not something to ignore. It's not prominent, but she also doesn't need this sort of photoshopping. She doesn't need to be flattered. This has started to emerge socially in the early United States as a point of pride that they are not. America is, and had begun while Stuart was away, building its own identity as a nation of rugged individuals. We were not the tyranny of the king and crown. We were people of the soil. We didn't need these titles of flattery. So we start to see that in how people are being presented and how they want to be presented as well. So there's a very popular story in Stuart literature that of a man who wanted his wife painted. It's popularly told that it's the Yeatses, and it's not. I have to tell people that. It's like weekly. It's now the Yeatses that he's talking about. The Yeatses were very happy with his portraits. These are prized works in the collection of the National Gallery, and they were prized in the possession of the Yeatses at the time. But Stuart, the story is told of someone who wanted their wife painted, and he's very unhappy with the end result. And he keeps asking Stuart to repaint it and make her prettier. And Stuart's response ultimately is, I am a painter. What do you ask? What are you asking of me? You do not give a man a potato and ask him to paint you a peach. And it's in that attitude that we see this style of work, his sort of final New York American style emerging. The Yeatses are very good friends with John Jay. And Stuart gets reintroduced to John Jay. On the left, you see a portrait of John Jay that Stuart had begun while in London. But Stuart doesn't always finish his portraits. That's the other thing that you need to know. We like to say at the museum that he completed over 1,000 stage paintings. That number is slightly small. And one of the reasons it's a small it is, despite him working consistently throughout his life, is that he couldn't really finish with the same measure of consistency that he would enthusiastically begin them. So the one on the left is a Stuart, but it's also a Trumbull because he didn't finish it. And if Jay wants a finished portrait, he was going to have to find someone else who was able to do that for him. Similar delays abounded with the later portrait of John Jay. Stuart, this time had a reason to finish. Because what he wanted more than anything else, a letter of introduction to George Washington. And Jay could get it for him. He's Jay adored him. He's willing to see the earlier portrait was never finished. He had to pay someone else to finish it, and yet he still valued Stuart's work enough that he eagerly sought to him again. Jay was out of town at the completion of the work, and we have several letters from his wife complaining bitterly about how that he is great and it's a beautiful portrait, but he won't finish it. And that that when he finally paid the completed painting, the very nearly completed painting, it actually did need to be finished further, that Stuart was adamant that Jay needed to provide that letter. So when he finally did, Stuart managed to approach Washington. This is now 3 years since he arrived in the United States with the explicit goal of painting Washington. So he has made his way to Philadelphia by himself. His family were left back in New York. And he comes along with, I will point out the timelines get a little muddled around here. Whether the list was compiled before or after the introduction, it was compiled in the same year, 1795. And Stuart managed, with the aid of the letter of introduction and the promises implicit in the letter, whether they were in doubt or not, to get an audience with Washington. Washington very much did not like sitting for portraits. He did do it at a profound amount of frequency, but largely out of a sense of obligation and an awareness of the role, that this was simply the cost of the role he'd have to take in both militarily and politically. So Washington did in 1795 send for Stuart. Stuart set up some offices near the Capitol building in Philadelphia. And these are got Washington to sit for him. It is worth pointing out at this point that people, as a rule, loved to sit for Stuart for exactly the same reason that he ended up continuously in debt. He would throw amazing parties. He was famous for his ability to speak at great length on a wide variety of topics. He had a military man sit before him, expound at great length, telling anecdotes and stories about military battles. He could talk politics. He could talk theater, art, business, whatever it was. He was famous for being able to speak engagingly about anything. Although there were within a few complaints that people would tell them stories in one sitting and would be told them back to, he would tell them back to the person, having forgotten who it was who told him the story in the first place. But Washington was famous for his dislike of showing emotion. In fact, one of the paintings was praised to Martha or to George that it shows his displeasure, and Washington famously said that no one has ever been able to determine my feelings from my countenance alone. So they did not really get along very well. This wasn't a pleasant experience for Washington, who did not like Stuart, did not like the fact that he'd run off to Europe to start a war. And he did not enjoy small talk, which is largely when with class Stuart's attempts to get him to relax. And Stuart couldn't get him to drop the facade that Washington so valued. Now, but this is one of the commissions that Stuart did complete. The original one, which is loosely called the Vaughan portrait, does not exist any longer. It's been destroyed. There are theorizations that that this one owned by Frick that's behind me is probably the closest to the one produced by that sitting. The one to the far, the one picture over there, is the one referred to as the Vaughan portrait. The Vaughan and Vaughan portrait, as well as the Gibbs Gibbs Channing Avery portion of the title of the third one, with the green background, come from the names of their owners. Stuart had commissions for approximately 39 of these works, and he produced as many copies as he could, and even hired an apprentice the very few times that he did, or not apprentice, an assistant to help with filling in the backgrounds on some of the images. Washington did not enjoy sitting for this painting, and Stuart didn't enjoy painting. So it was a surprise when a year later, Martha commissioned Stuart to come back to paint a marriage pair of the two, which would become known as the Athenaeum portrait. As you can see on both of these, they are you can't see it quite as well on the screen, but they are both marked out to be framed in oval frames. And the positioning of the two works are meant to hang together very much like this, with George and Martha face of one another. This is an extremely common set of common pairing paintings for married couples, which do have one of a different family, the different set of newlyweds, in the museum at the Gilbert birthplace, and you'd like to see a completed example of one. This is the version of Washington that everyone knows. Far fewer people are aware of Martha next to him, but she got the same treatment that he did. It was at this point in the production of the work that Stuart realized that he had been able to get this time what he hadn't got last time. And the reason for that is that he could get Washington this time, he was able to get Washington to relax. Some writers have pointed out that he had his fresh dentures and that his teeth were getting in particular difficulty at this point, which would have made it difficult for him to keep the stern facade he so loved. Stuart also, as the story goes, cracked his definition of small talk when a horse came by. Horse drove past the studio, and the Stuart was able to see him looking admiringly at the horse, and was able to get on to talking about horse breeding, which was a passion of Washington's. Stuart was also prepared this time and had Washington's family come and join him, have many of Washington's friends join him. People whose company he enjoyed and whose conversation he enjoyed as well. So that Washington would have a good time while he was sitting for Stuart, which in many ways the great of Stuart's method. Having gotten Washington to relax, to enjoy himself, not just to smile, but to also engage in the kind of personal tics, interests, smile, sense of humor that are distinctive as an individual. Stuart felt he was better able to capture this a sense of who the man was behind the magazine. Interestingly, it's difficult to talk. We do regularly at the birthplace talk about that painting in distinction from the Lansdowne portrait, which is behind me, which is probably not fair since the sitting are very difficult to identify whether these, honestly, which order they were painted in. It was the same summer of 1796 that Stuart received commission for this portrait as well. So it only required another day or so of posing from Washington. So whether we treat them as works that were dated up simultaneously and sat for at the same time, or as two separate settings, sittings is a distinction without a difference. Much like the Lansdowne style portrait from 1795, Stuart would copy this repeatedly. So these are both versions of this painting done by Stuart. Neither of them is the famous State House one. We'll see that one in a minute. Stuart would copy it extensively, much like he did with the Bond portrait. This, we'll see, is the Monroe Lennox portrait, produced, apologies my math, 4 years later. Stuart received a commission to paint 4 paintings, very much like the previous, so much like a Lansdowne portrait. It would be wrong to not mention the Rhode Island State House version up there. There was 4 of them that were produced at the same time. One was produced for the Rhode Island State House. One was for the Monroe Lennox Commission. That was a private commission. It's currently in the New York Public Library. One was produced for the Massachusetts State House, and the other was produced for the Newport Colony House. All but the private commission are, I believe, if not exactly, then very proximately close to where they were hung originally upon Stuart's completion. Apologies. One of the most common questions I get is that whether or not we stop now because this is where Stuart realized that he'd gotten in this sitting what he missed out on the previous sitting. Stuart begged Washington for dispensation to finish, to keep this, to stop the work here, so that he could keep it this as a study in his possession. It's always also worth pointing out that while this is possibly most famous painting in the United States, it would not have been understood as a painting during its time. It would be a study in oil, but it would have been would have not have been treated as a complete painting. You simply couldn't have this much exposed canvas and exposed primer in a painting that was considered fiction. So Stuart kept it for the rest of his life. He produced hundreds of copies. And much the same as he did that one. We see 3 different copies. One of the questions that we most commonly get is whether or not the copies by Stuart were finished. They were. These are 3 different ones that were all shown at the Metropolitan Museum of Art exhibition in 2005, the 250th retrospective of the anniversary of Stuart's birth. As you can see, the background would change regularly. The lace would change. His hair occasionally changes, and as does his facial expression. The Met is that exhibition was one of the first times that multiple of these paintings had been gathered together in one place and for a single exhibition. And one of the things that came out of that was the realization that most of them were produced during that initial period of 1766 and 1767, during which time Stuart, the studio across the street down the street from the Capitol in Philadelphia, was the house Washington, the proto-White House in Philadelphia. Stuart would have been saying Washington on a daily basis. So rather than consider them to be copies, it is probably a lot more reasonable to be considering them as, frankly, multitude of distinct originals, because Stuart is revising his image of Washington at the seal of that. One of the problems that comes with copying is that Stuart's not the only person who can do it. So while Stuart was responsible for the originals, these 2 paintings, and one of the things that comes from that 4-year gap between the 2 versions of the standing portrait of George Washington, is that we see when the commission came from the state of Rhode Island and the state of Massachusetts, Stuart took the opportunity to slightly revise the painting because copies were run rampant. Point of fact is there are a number of scholars who have argued that the one that's actually in the collection of the White House is not by Stuart. There were so many copies floating around that it was more or less impossible to keep track of which ones were authentic and which ones weren't. So, with this commission in hand, Stuart, in addition to complaining volubly to the newspaper, Stuart changed the composition ever so slightly, so that it would be identifiable that these ones from this commission were by him. So, the final question is this portrait by Stuart, the Athenaeum portrait. In the difference between the portraits Stuart achieved in 1795 and 1796 were evident to Stuart and to Washington as they sat there. These are the 2 images side by side, and one of them, to most audiences, looks very much like Washington, and the other one sort of does, but not really. It's worth looking. There is nothing technically wrong with apologies for my right and my left, the image on the left, that, as I said, is the Vaughan portrait, the first sitting. They're only 1 year apart in composition, so Washington didn't have time to change very much. It's worth looking at. Stuart wasn't the only person to paint Washington. He had already been painted extensively. These are some by Charles Wilson Peel and John Trumbull. They are earlier. Stuart painted only 1 image of Washington in military dress, and it was with full knowledge he did not get Washington to sit for it, and it was in full knowledge that Washington wouldn't have sat for it, because by the time that commission came, the Dorchester Heights portrait of Washington at Dorchester Heights, commissioned by Fallon Hall in Boston, Washington simply wouldn't have put on a military uniform. And so it was done, it was both commissioned and completed with full knowledge that Washington's place would be marked by a model and that the head of the Athenaeum portrait would be used in its stead. There's a reason Washington is in civilian dress in the standing portraits of Washington. So these show different artists' interpretation of Washington. They are all, it's worth pointing out, very young, while he was still considered himself to be a military man. Looking at more contemporary portraits, these are both from 1795 by Charles Willson Peale on the left and his son Rembrandt Peale on the right. We have Adolf Urich-Bertanever, German artist, was Swedish artist, that the Peales described as having something of a German aspect. Jean-Antoine Houdon's portrait bust of Washington. These were all done contemporaneously with Stuart. Well, the Houdon is a little earlier, but they were done more or less contemporaneously with Stuart's own impressions of Washington. And although that's what it looks closest, according just to Washington's own family, Houdon's is the correct. That is the most perfect image of Washington. When compared with the others, apologies. There you go. You can, Stuart's earlier 1795 attempt looks very similar to the work that you see of the Peales. Very technically correct, very polished, very much the way Washington presented himself publicly. I would argue one of the reasons that Stuart's second attempt, the Athenaeum portrait, has such a hold on the population is that Washington looks more human. That in many ways it captures what Catherine Breast Yates's image did, which was an element of strength that captured the sitter's own human imperfection. He is older. He's got wrinkles around his eyes. He's got jowls. Many point out many have argued that the fresh dentures in the image are visible. Not sure if that's good to take on as you have it. But it's an image of Washington where his humanity, to my eyes at least, seems to show through. And for that reason, it is in many ways the one that most strongly resembles the Houdon sculpture, and it's the one that has resonated most consistently with the American public. Obviously, it is the one on the $1 bill. I believe it was 1869. I have the date here. It's one of the oldest images to appear on currency. Same year, though, just a little bit of trivia. But the same year that became the image of the $1 bill, the Jefferson on the $2 bill also was codified. They are still in place today. Both of them are the same images. Both of them are actually by Stuart. So that's actually Stuart's portrait of Jefferson on the $2 bill. Most people at a certain age, however, will recognize Stuart's specific iteration of Washington from these images. These are not particularly elegant photographs. They're all taken from auction sites, but they all used to have it in schoolhouses. They were created as part of a federal initiative in 1932 to celebrate the bicentennial of Washington's birth. Interestingly, they were not the first. It was a Peale image of Washington that was originally chosen for reproduction in this painting. However, the public outcry was so great that the commission decided to reconsider its decision and instead use a cropped version of the Athenaeum Washington. So viewers of a certain age will have all grown up with this particular version of Washington in a gymnasium or classroom, school library. And that is mostly it. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, sir.
Did you ever